We cannot talk about economic development and economic globalization unless we talk about poverty and economic inequality. According to a 2018 study by Oxfam, there's enough resources on our planet to take care of all 7 billion people. The problem is the distribution and control of these resources. Most of us would like to live in a more egalitarian world, and yet inequality persists. Why? Well, Oxfam scholar Daniel Dorling argues that the reason that we continue to see inequality in our society is because people hold 5 beliefs. The first is the notion that elitism is universal, that the best succeed and those who are limited do not. It ignores the impact of opportunity and privilege within society. The second belief is that exclusion is necessary. In other words, we need an elite group to achieve, to advance, and to succeed. Third is the notion that prejudice is natural. It's part of human nature, and it's directed at those of the lowest social order. The fourth is that greed drives advancement. It drives economic growth. And finally, it's the belief that despair is inevitable. There's just no solution to global inequality. Taken together, those in power, and in some cases those who don't have power, justify the persistence of inequality. There's been a number of theoretical perspectives that further unpack the ways in which inequality is linked to economic globalization and development. And today we'll look at one of those, the world system theory. World system theory, or the world system model, was first outlined by Emanuel Wallerstein in 1979. It's a macro scale analysis, meaning it's looking at broader, overarching structures as opposed to the smaller individual interactions of people. Given that it's macro level, and we're talking about the world as the unit of analysis, all countries are caught up in this system. The world system approach examines the result of capitalism on international division of labor across the globe. This international division of labor separates nations into 3 different types of capitalist societies. There are core nations who control the world's wages and monopolize the production of manufactured goods and technology. These are the richest and most powerful nations on the globe. Then there are semi-periphery nations. They're more advanced developing nations. And these are places that might have urban centers, but also vast rural poverty. Core nations often contract work out of these nations and use semi-periphery nations as a buffer when there's tension between them and periphery nations. Periphery nations are those that are the poorest and the least powerful nations. They usually have an abundance of raw materials and resources, and they provide these materials as well as labor to the core and semi-periphery. They're frequently exploited for their resources, which benefits core nations. Sometimes it's useful to look at a visual to understand the relationship between core, semi-periphery, and periphery nations in the world system model. Here you can see that periphery nations are providing both cheap labor and raw materials to both semi-periphery and core nations. Semi-periphery nations are providing labor and materials to core nations, and core nations are providing high profit consumption goods to both periphery and semi-periphery nation. Although it's been brought into question how useful these high profit consumption goods are to individuals living specifically in periphery nations. It's important to note that while most of the time people think about core, semi periphery, and periphery nations within the context of an individual country fitting into one of these unique categories, there are places such as China and India where there could be all three societies existing within the context of a single country. There are many ways that powerful core societies can extract profit from semi periphery and periphery nations and further global inequality. First, they can manipulate the rules of international trade. For example, agriculture is Africa's biggest economic sector. It has the capacity to produce a lot more food and export to Europe and the United States. But it can't because the EU and the US spend billions of dollars each year subsidizing their farmers so imported African products seem more expensive. Second, Western corporations sometimes use their economic power to negotiate favorable tax deals in the developing world. A good case in point is the mining company Glencore in Zambia. The company recently arranged a long term contract to mine copper with the Zambian government. It exports $6 billion a year in copper from Zambia, but only pays $50 million in taxes. While, as part of the deal, the Zambian government is contractually obliged to pay for all electricity cost of mining, which can total about $150 million a year. Finally, there has been an increase in recent years in what's known as land grabs, where a Western government or company buys up thousands of hectares of land in Africa with the intention of planting it with food or biofuel crops for export back to Western markets. In such cases, Western companies take advantage of the cheap land and gain much more than the African nations selling the land in the long term. In some case studies of land grabs, thousands of indigenous people have been displaced. Like any theory, you have to take the world system model with a grain of salt. There have been numerous critiques of the world system approach. One is that there's more causes to underdevelopment than capitalism, and world system theory does not look at cultural factors, corruption, or ethnic conflict. Another critique is some tribal societies are not impacted by capitalism, and that there are other ways that people are exploited and oppressed, especially if we think of social factors such as race, ethnicity, religion, or gender. And finally, one critique of the world system model is that it's difficult to empirically test, and thus it remains a theory